CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. France's president welcomes Germany's new chancellor as the two leaders pledge to keep the Franco-German alliance strong.
Our other headlines: compulsory face coverings in theatres, cinemas and indoor venues as the UK introduces new regulations to stem soaring COVID cases.
London calling. Shell shareholders vote to move the company's headquarters from the Netherlands to the UK.
And shares are soaring in this popular pork product. We look at why people are buying Spamalot.
2 days into the job, Germany's new chancellor is working to cement what will be some of his most important international relationships.
Olaf Scholz is now in Brussels, where he's meeting EU and NATO leaders, and earlier he held talks in Paris with the French President Emmanuel Macron.
Let's talk now to our correspondent Ryan Thompson in Brussels. So Ryan, Europe's two most powerful leaders have held a press conference. What did they say?
Hi there, Robin. That's right. Just a little bit earlier, we were listening to Olaf Scholz alongside his French counterpart, French President Emmanuel Macron, at the Élysée Palace in Paris, where they were touching on a number of issues. But of course, they're really getting down to work and just cementing the importance of the Franco-German relationship 2 days into Olaf Scholz's new tenure as Germany's chancellor. Of course, he took the job on Wednesday, but Thursday was only his first full day in office, and now he is heading off to Paris and Brussels. But these are quite big shoes to fill because, of course, he's taking over for Angela Merkel after 16 years, where she very clearly became not only Europe's most senior statesperson, but also most powerful and really was a guiding figure, not to mention the fact that she worked very, very closely with Emmanuel Macron, that you had a close relationship. They were able to navigate a number of crises together. And so now we're at the point where those two have to figure out how they will do the same. They've known each other for many years now. Olaf Scholz is no stranger to Paris, of course, because he was Germany's finance minister, which is a very influential position across the bloc, and something that's watched not just from corners of Germany, but also from corners of really all across Europe. They have underscored that they want to continue the cooperation that has been such a defining point of the Merkel-Macron relationship. And they also really want to carry on a number of the policy priorities that had been established long before this changeover in German government.
We are all concerned about the situation on the Ukrainian border. It's quite obvious. There are lots of soldiers, and that's why it's quite right this is now being discussed. We have a good foundation, for example, the talks with France, Russia and Ukraine in the Normandy format. The security of borders in Europe is one of the principles that everyone in Europe must accept for common security.
And of course, you heard there Scholz mentioning the fact that the rising tensions on the border of Russia and Ukraine are a big part of his discussions in Paris, the discussion of whether they will return to the Normandy format, those roundtable discussions between Germany, France, Russia and the Ukraine. Now there's also talk that this will be a high agenda item as he heads to Brussels, meets with the European Commission, the European Council and, of course, NATO, which is deeply wrapped up in this crisis.
And Ryan, Scholz also meeting Ursula von der Leyen in Brussels. What are they talking about?
Well, Robin, that meeting is ongoing as we are speaking now, but we're getting just some of the early comments as they take questions from reporters just across the street at the European Commission headquarters. It does seem like their meeting is really focusing on European security, notably in the question of energy, but also migration, because, of course, we've seen these increasing flare-ups on the Belarusian-Polish border and the arrival of migrants being pushed over, the back and forth. It's been a contentious EU issue, but Germany has also dealt some of the cards here in terms of its play within the bloc. They're also on the agenda issues with China, Russia, EU Chips Act, and booster vaccines, really cementing the European policy as a way to fight COVID-19. It's no secret that as Olaf Scholz comes to the table in his own country, he's assuming a big role in terms of the European table as well. And so as Europe is faced to all of these crises, all of these problems and all of these challenges, he will have a lot to discuss with his fellow German counterpart who's leading the Commission here in Brussels.
Ryan, you mentioned that close relationship between Merkel and Macron. That will be a tough act to follow, won't it?
Absolutely, Robin. Actually, the Elysée and Emmanuel Macron released a video just on Wednesday when the world said goodbye to Angela Merkel in her capacity as Chancellor. And it was quite a touching video. It actually made me well up a little bit in the eyes because these two really worked quite close together and drew on a strong relationship. The video starts with them taping a taped message together, and you can see the candor that they really have, whether it's in German, in English, or in French. They really had a special relationship where they learned to trust each other, but also learn to play with each other and work together very, very closely. When it came time in November for France to host an official send-off to Angela Merkel, again, another touching moment where Emmanuel Macron acknowledged the fact that Angela Merkel, a senior statesperson who came from Eastern Germany pre-reunification, was able to work with this young guy who was leading the other big European powerhouse, and together they had the unthinkable dream, really navigating European crises one after another, but also building on that Franco-German alliance and leading it to a very, very special place. So Olaf Scholz, there's no doubt that he potentially can't do the same thing, but again, these are big shoes for him to fill, Robin.
Ryan, thank you very much. Ryan Thompson there in Brussels.
New measures to deal with rising cases of the Omicron coronavirus variant have come into effect in England under the UK government's so-called Plan B.
People have been asked to work from home when they can. Face masks are mandatory in many public spaces, while some venues will require COVID passports.
So how are people reacting to the new rules around the country? Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Andrew Wilson in Liverpool. Andrew, Plan B, new restrictions for England and, I guess, a sense of déjà vu.
Yes, Jamie, had a tired sense as well. I think people know the drill. They know what's coming. They know what kind of Christmas they're looking at. And with an air of resignation, frankly, to most people that you speak to in towns like this up and down the country, they've got their masks back on. They're now starting to make decisions about whether or not they're going to use public transport, whether or not they will have that dinner in a restaurant or a pub tonight or nearer Christmas, whether they will go to office parties, whether they will have parties with their own companies at all. Everyone's having to rethink exactly what they didn't want to do. They're having to rethink their Christmas, how they're going to behave, how their places of work are going to behave with the advent of this Omicron virus, which has created a complete new set of rules and a complete new raft of uncertainties as how they can continue. So that's come from the government. It hasn't been enforced, really. There's been the suggestion that people should work from home if they can. There's a suggestion that people should wear masks and in public places and on public transport particularly. That can be enforced. But otherwise, it's all been left pretty much up to the judgment of the people. And there's a few reasons for that. But the principal one, of course, is that this is not a new lockdown. This is not a fresh period of government-mandated restraint and restriction, and so there will be no financial cover for it. There won't be any furlough, there won't be any support for people who can't go to work now because of these restrictions. They'll be told to stay at home if they possibly can, but not necessarily forced to stay away from home. The government can't afford to finance another lockdown, but they're also hoping that this may be briefer than people think at this stage, that the Omicron variant may throw up some more information, some more surprises that allow them to rethink their strategy on this. The House of Commons meets on Monday to talk about whether or not COVID passports will have to become mandatory, but only for large gatherings, public events, sports events and things like that. It's not going to be a huge restriction, but there will be pushback, even from in the Prime Minister's own party on that one as well. So they're still playing it by ear to see what Omicron throws up as to how far they're going to have to push it. But for the general public, they know what to do. They're not happy about it, but they don't really see themselves as having much of a choice at the moment.
Meanwhile, political pressure on Boris Johnson, those banned Christmas parties and the lack of grip in Downing Street show no signs of going away.
It's an extraordinary example of British politics being drawn out when perhaps, Jamie, it didn't need to be. If this had been dealt with when the first allegations about these Christmas parties from last year were made clear to the public, there could have been perhaps a more decisive reaction. That didn't happen, and we are where we are now as far as Downing Street's situation is concerned. That also happens to chime in with a refreshment of the concerns about how exactly the Prime Minister redecorated his flat when he first moved into number 10, if that was something that he knew more about than he let on at the time. So there's these issues of honesty now doing the rounds. Now, the media did know about these parties last Christmas for quite some time, but had to wait for a moment when it wouldn't be problematic or would be considered to be in the public interest to release that information. Now, given that the position the Prime Minister's taken about these parties, they feel it's the right time to release videos as well as other evidence of these parties taking place. The Prime Minister still persists that all is not as it seems and that no real rules were broken, and he's sticking to his original story on that, even while the storm clouds and the evidence gather around him to suggest that perhaps indeed things weren't as he's been saying. It's not so much a question of honesty. The Prime Minister does have a reputation for being fast and loose with the truth, and people factor that in now when they consider his leadership. But it's the possibility that members of government gather together in violation of the rules, laughing, as it appears, at the rest of the country for having to obey a different set of rules. That is something that many will consider unconscionable. And if it does make a dent in the polls, which this week it may be showing signs of actually doing, in other words, costing the government dearly in the polls out there in the constituencies across the country, then there are plenty of people warming their knives up to get ready to remove Boris Johnson should the opportunity arise. We're not there yet, but there are whispers in Westminster.
Andrew Wilson in Liverpool, thank you very much.
As the new variant spreads globally, some early evidence suggests that Omicron is more easily transmissible than the Delta variant. Dr. Hans Kluge from the World Health Organization says wealthy countries must do more than just impose travel bans and border controls, which he says are ineffective.
The mantra is straightforward. The more transmission, the more variants. And that's why it's in the interest of richer countries like the G7, like the G20, to take a much bolder action, because they will not be safe until the rest of the world is safe. No one is safe until everyone is safe, and I have seen with Omicron and even with the original strain of the COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, which spread globally so fast. And there even border controls, stopping of traveling is not going to help, because we can't stop the virus. So the more transmission, the more variants.
And you can see the full interview next week on The Agenda here on CGTN.
You're watching CGTN, still ahead. Starbucks staff in New York State celebrate voting to form a union, though it might make the management splutter.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
This week on Razor, making the cosmic dust that made our solar system here on Earth. and using the techniques of infrared astronomy to safeguard endangered animals.
The survival of the human species depends on the environment. Without the oceans, without the forests, without a good functioning ecosystem, we might survive, but it's not going to be as it is now.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Just a reminder that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Shareholders in the Anglo-Dutch oil giant Shell have voted overwhelmingly to move the company's headquarters to London from The Hague. The executives say it'll make the payment of dividends more efficient, but critics say it's been driven by strict climate rules in the Netherlands. Our correspondent Stefan de Vries is in Amsterdam and has been following the story for us. Stefan, just what prompted Shell's decision to leave the Netherlands?
Well, there was actually no real reason to leave the country right now. In 2005, the company merged permanently between Royal Dutch Shell and the oil company, and it created a very complex structure with two different shares. So the board of directors said that this was a permanent situation, that they had to unravel this complicated company to be more competitive. But maybe the real reason is somewhere else, and that's here in the Netherlands, or more precisely in The Hague, where the Dutch government, led by Prime Minister Mark Rutte of the Liberal Party, was planning on scrapping the dividend tax. A couple of years ago, the Parliament voted against scrapping this, and that has probably triggered Shell to move from The Hague to London because the company didn't want to pay any dividend tax anymore, and so that marks the end of over a century of this Anglo-Dutch company, Royal Dutch Shell.
So what are the benefits from being based in London?
Well, the economical benefit is that the company is now one single company with a very simple share structure. Another advantage is, of course, is that dividend tax does not exist in the UK. So all the dividends paid by Shell in the UK are not taxed. And then there's another reason. Shell was convicted by a court in The Hague to cut its CO2 emissions by 45% in 2030. Shell appealed, but it made it very difficult for the company to stay any longer in the Netherlands, although the judgment could count for the whole world. So the benefit is now today purely economical, but it will have some long-term effects as well, because Shell has to transform into an environmentally friendly company, and that is one of the challenges the company is facing now.
Stefan de Vries in Amsterdam, thank you very much.
Dr. Edward Thomas-Jones is an economics lecturer at Bangor University in Wales. I asked if the move by Shell would have an impact on Amsterdam as a financial centre.
I don't think there's concerns that Amsterdam is losing momentum. Clearly, Amsterdam have been one of the winners from Brexit. We've seen a lot of trading activities move across to the cities, and investors seem to be happy there. Also, the regulator in Amsterdam has been favourable towards investors.
And it's also attracting a lot of new listings. Why are they choosing Amsterdam over, say, London?
It is to do with the flexibility that the regulators have shown. Amsterdam very early on developed expertise in SPACs, and the Amsterdam Stock Exchange has become the main European market for such listings. Also, the depth of the market there, their international reputations, all of these have built up to allow Amsterdam to be a winner in the space in the European market.
And you mentioned Brexit. What impact has that had on Amsterdam?
Well, clearly we've seen equities and derivatives business move from London to Amsterdam, so they've clearly become a winner in that space. But it's also put Amsterdam in the spotlight for investors. It became on their radar that London wasn't the only option in Europe. Amsterdam themselves then have been able to build upon that. Again, their regulators have been flexible. They've also developed expertise in products such as SPACs, And then all of this together has allowed them to succeed in this area.
And we have to mention the pandemic, of course. What impact has that had?
Of course, the pandemic has been an interesting situation in that we have seen governments pump a lot of money into the economies in order to try and combat the pandemic, and of course some of that has flowed into the stock market. So there has been some benefit there for the Amsterdam stock market from the pandemic because of the way governments have responded.
And with some big tech companies choosing Amsterdam, do you think we'll see it become a hub for that sector?
In the short term, certainly there will be, Amsterdam will benefit there, but we have to remember that London is viewed as being the tech centre for Europe. So I can imagine in the medium or long term, we'll start seeing much more listings back in London.
The UK's economy grew by a weaker than expected 0.1% in October, which follows a stronger performance earlier this year. But the rebound has slowed in recent months as supply chain problems hit manufacturers. It's feared new COVID restrictions could also slow momentum.
Shares in Daimler Truck have climbed after their debut on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. The heavy goods vehicle firm was spun off from its holding group Daimler AG in February. Daimler AG, which will soon be renamed Mercedes-Benz AG, has retained a 35% stake in the company.
The company behind the plan to drill in one of the UK's biggest undeveloped oil fields says it's pausing the project. The Cambo oil field is around 125 kilometres to the west of Scotland's Shetland Islands. The developer, Siccar Point Energy, made the announcement after its partner, Shell, pulled out of the project last week.
US coffee giant Starbucks has just experienced a first in its 50-year history after a store in New York State voted to form a trade union. It comes after workers in a Buffalo outlet voted in favour, making it the only one of nearly 9,000 stores to be unionised. The workers' victory came despite Starbucks management's opposition. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Sarah Walton in New York. So, Sarah, what does it mean for Starbucks to have its staff unionise?
Well, first off, we should say this is very rare for Starbucks. So rare, this is the only branch in the whole of the United States of the coffee chain to have done this, and there are an awful lot of Starbucks in this country. I mean, there's about 4 within a block of where I work and 9,000 right across the country. So this staff at the store in Buffalo in New York State, they voted 19-8 in favour of forming a union. They say they were prompted to do this by poor working conditions and a shortage of staff. Essentially, they say that the app that exists now, where people can order their drinks and food before turning up at a Starbucks, has massively increased their workload. There was also a vote at another branch nearby where they didn't vote in favour of unionising, and a third vote as well elsewhere, which is still being resolved. There's some conflict over the result of that one. But there is no doubt this is going to rattle Starbucks. They did everything they could to stop this happening. They flew in big company bosses to speak to the group. They say they are hiring new staff, they are getting new equipment in. They've also highlighted that they give a lot of benefits to their employees, such as healthcare, paid sick and parental leave, which is certainly not a given in the service industry here in the United States. Now, this won't make any huge difference initially at this branch in Buffalo. They have to now negotiate a contract with Starbucks, which won't be easy, seeing as they opposed the unionisation. But what would be interesting is to see how this inspires other branches to take a vote as well. There are 3 other branches in the Buffalo area that have applied to have a vote, and 1 in Arizona as well. And if Starbucks starts doing it, then, there could be other cafes and restaurants across the country that start doing it as well.
And Sarah, I'm not sure how well coffee goes with canned meat, but Spam is celebrating. Tell us more.
Yeah, Spam sales are up. They've hit a record high number of sales for the 7th year in a row. Hormel, who makes Spam, say the sales were up 43% on the year before to 3.5 billion, and their shares were up 6% following that news on Thursday in New York. So who is buying Spam? I mean, I'm not sure we can put this down to Monty Python anymore after so long. I know it's a bit of a joke here and, in Europe as well. But Spam incredibly popular in many other parts of the world. In Hawaii, for example, where someone I know who went there recently was offered spam sushi. And Asia is a massive market, particularly South Korea, where spam is part of one of their most popular dishes. So that is where this demand is coming from. Hormel say they're going to be increasing their production capacity to keep up with that demand, and also they say come out with some new products, variations on spam, and that one could be interesting because a couple of years ago they came out with pumpkin spice spam here in the US for the fall season, which I never managed to get my hands on and try. I'm not sure about that, but I'd be interested to see if they come up with any other novelty flavours. I don't know, maybe gingerbread for Christmas or something.
Well, Sarah, we've had many reminiscences about spam in the office today, but I think pumpkin spiced spam might be a step too far. Thanks very much indeed.
It's sacrilege messing around with the original
I know,
recipe,
traditional spam's the only way. Spam fritters, maybe.
Spam and chips.
Spam chips. Spam, egg and chips. Spam.
Spam on its own. Anyway, the cost of goods in the United States has risen 6.2% in the 12 months to October, the fastest rate for 3 decades.
For the rest of the world, higher energy bills, supply chain issues and the reintroduction of lockdown measures continue to drag on economies.
Well, Germany is no exception, and it's the new government must deal with rising household bills amid an increasingly uncertain economic outlook. Trent Murray reports.
As the Christmas holiday fast approaches, the financial crunch is being felt at the cash register as shoppers across Germany experience a rapid rise in spending costs. Inflation is at a 29-year high in Europe's biggest economy, with the most recent analysis revealing November saw a headline inflation rate of 5.2%. Much of the rise is being fueled by higher electricity bills, with energy costs jumping 22% in November compared to the same time last year, placing a burden on many household budgets.
The consumer climate is currently being pinched from 2 sides. On the one hand, we are experiencing the 4th wave, with strongly rising incidence rates, with problems in the health sector and increasing restrictions that are just coming into force. On the other hand, we are experiencing price hikes and rising inflation. These 2 things together are really pinching the consumer sector at the moment.
The European Central Bank acknowledges that the cost of living pressures are having an impact across the Eurozone, especially as the economy tries to recover from the damage dealt by the pandemic.
For inflation to return sustainably to our target when interest rates are near the effective lower bound, we need to be persistent in our monetary policy. In particular, we must not rush into a premature tightening when faced with passing or supply-driven inflation shocks.
As the Eurozone's biggest economy, what happens here in Germany has a major impact on the other 18 members of the Euro Monetary Union. With a change of government underway in that building behind me, incoming Chancellor Olaf Scholz will be expected to move quickly on the economic challenges facing the country. Scholz will likely lean on his experience as the country's former finance minister when he takes over from Angela Merkel, meaning voters will be closely scrutinising his response to inflationary pressures.
The majority of Germans actually tolerate things, tolerate developments like even lockdowns, as long as the economy is fine, as long as their personal life is fine, as long as they feel like I have a prosperous life, I can afford things, everything is going well. When these things change, the German middle classes particularly start revolting in a way, start saying we don't like what the government is doing.
It will remain a difficult balancing act for the new Chancellor, trying to effectively manage the pressures of the pandemic and the economy, with the decisions taken by his government likely to reverberate not just at home, but across much of Europe and the world. Trent Murray, CGTN, Berlin.
In Australia, low interest rates are pushing house prices to record highs. But researchers warn that the property boom is also driving inequality and posing increased risks to the country's economy. Greg Navarro reports.
Selling a home in Sydney has rarely been more profitable.
In the last year, the price rises in the sort of wake of the worst of the pandemic have been at a level which has been quite extraordinary.
Sydney has experienced the biggest increase. The median house price jumped 30% in just 12 months. Many cities are seeing the steepest rises in more than 3 decades.
Have to be around 2.1 or better.
Record low interest rates are driving a rush to secure home loans and helping to create what appears to be a post-pandemic economic driver. University of New South Wales professor Hal Pawson sees it much differently.
Housing is really an unproductive asset, and we're sinking, really as a country, we're sinking far too much money, too much debt. We're committing too much of our income to paying for that debt on a product that doesn't really create a lot of employment and knock-on economic activity beyond itself.
The dream of home ownership is slipping away for an increasing number of people.
If we have a growing gap between people who have a lot of wealth and people who are doing ordinary jobs but who are unable to sort of, take advantage of the benefits of home ownership, then that grows all sorts of social divisions.
Housing advocates say higher income families are moving to regional areas in search of larger properties. That trend is preventing more people who live in those areas from accessing rental markets.
It's been really heartbreaking and stressful.
Naomi Thompson has spent the last 2 years trying to find a home to rent in the New South Wales city of Orange.
It's soul-destroying and heart-crushing that time and time and again I look and there's just nothing I can do, and I don't feel very good. It's very, it demoralises your self-worth.
There's been a long-held belief that Australia's housing market is fueled by a lack of adequate supply, meaning there simply aren't enough houses in many cities, including here in Sydney. But over the last couple of years, the country's international borders have remained closed, and the migration tap has essentially been turned off.
So in actual fact, it's government policy that's really behind some of the increases in house prices.
Housing advocates want the federal government to scrap outdated policies originally designed decades ago to encourage property investment through tax concessions. Pawson says Australia needs to adopt a national housing strategy.
The problems that are caused by the housing system are not only problems that affect a relatively small number of individuals who are directly affected.
Otherwise, he says, skyrocketing house prices will continue to come with the kind of costs that no one could really afford.
Greg Navarro reporting from Sydney.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange can be extradited from the UK to the United States as Washington wins the latest round of its legal battle.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city. for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. France's president welcomes Germany's new chancellor as the two leaders pledge to keep the Franco-German alliance strong.
Our other headlines: compulsory face coverings in theatres, cinemas and indoor venues as the UK introduces new regulations to stem soaring COVID cases.
And London calling. Shell shareholders vote to move the company's headquarters from the Netherlands to the UK.
The United States government has won an appeal at the High Court in London over the extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. The ruling means Assange is a step closer to being sent to the United States to face charges over the publication of classified military documents. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Guy Henderson at the High Court. Guy, just what did the United States say that got the decision overturned?
Well, Jamie, it's been more than a decade now since Julian Assange shot to global fame, global notoriety, depending, of course, on which side of the debate you stand, when his organisation WikiLeaks leaked that massive trove of classified US government documents. And since then, the United States government has tried to do everything it can to extradite Assange to the United States to stand trial over those leaked documents, but they've not been able to do so even now. This ruling at the High Court in London, that you'll see behind me, is a step closer to making that extradition a reality. Earlier in the year, a district court judge had ruled that Assange was not fit for extradition to the US on mental health grounds. When the US government side launched their appeal, one of the things their lawyers included in their arguments was a series of assurances that essentially Assange's well-being would be guaranteed and that they would keep essentially a very close eye on him. That was enough for Lord Chief Justice Lord Burnett to conclude that he would overrule that initial ruling in the district court and grant and decide that Assange was indeed fit for extradition.
Guy, is this now the end of the legal road? I mean, what reaction from Assange's team? Will they appeal?
I think that's thought to be the next likely move by the Assange legal team. Yes, we heard his fiancée describe this ruling as a grave miscarriage of justice. The judges, of course, would have to accept that a request for an appeal. But even if it was rejected, there is still the option for the Assange legal team to take things a step further, which is to seek a stay of extradition at the European Court of Human Rights. So, look, it's been a decade-long fight or more so far, and whichever way things go from here, there is still somewhat of a legal path and a legal fight ahead of us.
Guy Henderson at the High Court in London. Thank you very much.
Hungary's constitutional court has dismissed a challenge to an EU ruling against the country's asylum policy, but judges did rule that Budapest can enforce its constitution over some EU regulations. Earlier this year, the European Court of Justice ordered Hungary to suspend its policy of returning asylum seekers across the Serbian border, prompting the legal challenge from Prime Minister Viktor Orban's government.
China and Nicaragua have re-established diplomatic ties after the Central American country broke off diplomatic relations with Taiwan. The two sides signed a communique in which Nicaragua acknowledged the One China policy, which states that Taiwan is a part of China's territory.
Former US President Trump has launched a withering attack on his one-time ally, former Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu. Using foul language, he told Israeli journalists that Netanyahu had been disloyal and said he was furious at the way he congratulated President Joe Biden on his election victory. Trump also claimed he had personally saved Israel from destruction.
People across Myanmar have been taking part in a so-called silent strike, leaving highways, shopping centres and marketplaces empty. The strike is seen as a way to safely express opposition amid a crackdown on protesters and activists opposed to the military's February takeover.
At least 54 people have died after a lorry they were travelling in overturned in Mexico. They were among around 150 people crammed inside the truck, all thought to be migrants from Central America trying to reach the United States. The victims are thought to include women and children. CGTN's Frank Contreras is in Mexico City.
The details are now just starting to come in on this tragic highway incident that took place in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas. Civil protection authorities in the state of Chiapas, speaking to witnesses, are told that the truck was carrying more than 100 people aboard, a tractor trailer. It was traveling at excessive speed. Witnesses say it hit a sharp curb, and in that moment, the driver lost control tragically. The vehicle flipped over and smashed into a pedestrian bridge in the area there and also into a concrete structure. And of course, that was disastrous. Bodies were strewn all about the highway. Eyewitnesses have reported that bodies are now being shown on social media, covered up in white cloth, lying on the roadway there where this tragic incident took place. Authorities saying that this took place on a highway in the southern state of Chiapas, as we reported, between the town of Chiapa de Corzo and the state capital, Tuxtla Gutierrez. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador is lamenting this tragic situation. His foreign relations minister as well, Marcelo Ebrard, both of them sending condolences to the families, showing support for the tragedy, and of course pointing out that this is one of the major tragedies that have happened on Mexican roadways involving migrants in many, many years. This tragedy comes just a day after the United States began to use again this new system called Remain in Mexico. It's a migrant protection protocol, so-called program under the Trump administration, whereby migrants are now required to remain in Mexico. Some civil liberties organizations and human rights organizations pointing out that this has led to a lot of other sorts of disasters involving migrants. Now, the situation now involving the crash, we're told that at least 58 people have been sent to hospital, some of them in very grave condition. So that means the possibility of the death toll rising here in Mexico in this deadly incident.
Frank Contreras in Mexico City.
In Vienna, there's cautious optimism after Iran appeared to soften its position at the nuclear talks with Western powers. World leaders are hoping to revive the 2015 deal to limit uranium enrichment. Natalie Carney reports.
Sources said Iran wants to continue talks with world powers on its nuclear development based on texts decided on back in June. If this is true, that would be something of a U-turn for Tehran, which angered Western officials last week by submitting two proposals that EU and US delegations said disregarded previous compromises and contain new demands. The U.S. and Israel then began ramping up threats against Iran of possible economic or even military consequences if diplomacy fails.
If diplomacy cannot get on track soon, and if Iran's nuclear program continues to accelerate, then we will have no choice but to take additional measures to further restrict Iran's revenue-producing sectors.
World powers say they will assess Iran's seriousness to return to the June agreements over the next few days. However, Iran's chief negotiator Ali Bagheri Khani said working groups to discuss Iran's new proposals would begin on Friday. The need for these proposals comes down to Iran's new conservative government, which was elected over the summer and does not recognize the text drafts in the first 6 rounds of talks. They are arguing for everything to be renegotiated and demanding that all post-2018 U.S. sanctions be removed before Tehran returns to compliance with the 2015 nuclear agreement, otherwise known as the JCPOA. Under that deal, Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program in exchange for relief of Western sanctions. But all that fell apart back in 2018 when the U.S. withdrew from the accord. Natalie Carney for CGTN in Munich.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Unvaccinated holiday shoppers are warned to stay away from Hungary's Christmas markets.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. The South African city of Cape Town had been looking forward to a busy summer holiday tourist season before the discovery of the new Omicron COVID variant.
That saw countries across the globe banning travel to the region. Now, without the expected influx of international visitors, Cape Town tourism is focusing on domestic travellers instead. Renee Del Carme reports.
Don't let travel bans ruin your travel plans. That's the message the city of Cape Town is using to attract Cape Townians and visitors from across South Africa this holiday season. Cape Town Tourism says it has put together a collection of pocket-friendly offers and packages to encourage locals to be tourists in their own city.
These international travel bans have certainly caused massive uncertainty and disruption, and it will have a devastating impact on the tourism industry. And so therefore we are turning our attention now to domestic. For this travel ban to have come at this moment in time has been a bitter pill to swallow, because our forward bookings have shown double-digit growth for the period December, January and February and even beyond. And so when these travel bans come in with no warning and based on unscientific facts, we have a problem. And so it's really been very disappointing.
We've had thousands, if not tens of thousands of cancellations. We've estimated that at about 250 million rand in lost investment expenditure in the city just in December. So it's a really huge impact for our local tourism industry. Our message to domestic tourists is quite simple. Don't let your Christmas be ruined by red lists and travel bans. Hop on a plane, come to Cape Town.
Cape Town Tourism says it's confident that South Africans will flock to the city during its peak summer season.
We've just recently run a survey of the domestic market and the intent to travel to Cape Town this festive season. And what we found was an overwhelming resounding saying, yes, they want to come to Cape Town. They've had a tough year. They want to relax with friends and family. So we are encouraging people to come down to Cape Town.
This bicycle rental spot on the Atlantic seaboard in Sea Point is one of the many urban adventure experiences Cape Town Tourism wants visitors to take advantage of this festive season.
The city of Cape Town says it needs every ounce of support to keep the wheels turning in its tourism industry, which supports tens of thousands of much-needed jobs.
Where else would you rather be than right here, right now?
Renee Dalkalm, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
How will competitors get to the Beijing Winter Olympics, and where will they stay when they arrive?
These were among the details just set out by the event's organising committee, who've also cooked up a menu fit for athletes. Sui Hui Ao reports.
With international flights largely reduced due to the COVID-19 pandemic, how will athletes arrive in Beijing? The organising committee has laid out a plan.
We encourage Olympic delegations to arrive in Beijing mainly by charter flights and temporary flights. So far, China's Civil Aviation Department has confirmed with 17 airlines to provide temporary flights to and from Beijing.
Commercial flight is also an option as long as the first entry point is Beijing Capital International Airport. Participants are required to take 2 nucleic acid tests within 4 days before departure. Upon arrival, they will enter a closed-loop system through specific lanes at the airport before being transported to over 80 designated hotels.
Since October, we have used nearly 30 hotels for test events, a third of which are contracted hotels. We have also restructured over 100 rooms to accommodate Paralympic athletes.
The food menu has also been carefully crafted to cater to different religious beliefs and diets, while providing high-quality, safe, and healthy products. For example, popular Chinese specialties like Peking duck and sweet dumplings are in the menu. As for transportation, over 4,000 vehicles will be used for the Olympics and Paralympics. Most minibuses use new energy or clean energy, and 24-hour taxi service will also be available within the closed loop. With the Beijing 2022 Winter Games some 50 days away, officials say it's like the war drum is beating. Next, they will focus on details while accelerating specific preparations. The goal is to present high-quality games for participants from around the world. So, CGTN, Beijing.
China's appetite for imported food has grown over the last 2 decades.
Greater spending power and a fondness for new flavours have drawn Chinese consumers towards the international food shelves in supermarkets.
Timothy Pope reports now from Shanghai.
As Chinese consumers' disposable income has risen, it's brought with it a demand for higher quality foods, and for many that means imports. The latest report released at the 4th China International Import Expo says the value of China's food imports reached $107.7 billion last year. That rising demand has brought to China a notable number of multinational retailing giants like Costco and Sam's Club. They run successful warehouse stores offering a greater variety of imported foods than normal shops do. But benchmarking that success, many domestic retailers are now getting in on the banquet too.
30% of our food products are imported. Those from Japan, the Republic of Korea, and the Belt and Road countries and regions sell quite well. So we are trying to bring a greater variety now.
Things have moved so far, so fast that you can now find some food imports in neighbourhood stores as well, thanks to the development of cross-border e-commerce and international logistics. Often enough, if you want some seasonal fruit imports, you can just check a fruit shop nearby. Chinese consumers are now adapting to more exotic foreign tastes as well.
20 years ago, bananas were China's most popular imported fruit. But by 2020, durian was top of the list. On the other hand, apples and pears have always been China's top fruit exports. The country now exports 15 times more than it did 20 years ago. Most of it goes to North and South America.
According to the China Chamber of Commerce for the import and export of foodstuffs, China's fruit exports hit almost 3.9 million tonnes in 2020, with a value of $6.4 billion. Compared to the previous year, these figures were a 7% increase in export volume and a 16% increase in value. Timothy Pope, ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
Europe.cgtn.com has all the week's top stories from China. Here's a quick take. All that and more at cgtn.com.
For many people in Budapest, there is no Christmas without the traditional Christmas fair.
But this year, the organisers are paying much more attention to safety. The event is only open to visitors with a vaccination certificate. Andrzej Nash reports.
The Vörösmarty Square market opened on the 19th of November in the very heart of Budapest. However, due to the pandemic, this year's fair is a little different to before. Some come to enjoy hot drinks, others are in the hunt for a Christmas present. Market traders here say everyone can find what they're looking for at the iconic Christmas market. With nearly 50 artisan stores, unique items from ceramics and tempting gingerbread to designer hats and scarves can be found here. Although the mood here is still festive, this year's fair is a little different from previous years. For the first time this year, catering outlets will be able to offer cash-free payment to avoid handling cash. Visitors must also have a COVID immunity or a vaccine certificate.
We wanted to make sure that people visiting this fair can live without getting the disease. So first of all, that was why we introduced this measurement, and the second of all, actually to meet the Hungarian law, it was mandatory. We are expecting 1,000 people to this fair every night, and according to the Hungarian law, if you organize anything for more than 500 people, it is mandatory to ask for a vaccination card.
We are felt, which is a big difference from before. Fortunately, there are still quite a few people in the square.
Because in France we have the same rules, the same. Yeah.
I have a vaccination certificate. Yeah, it's no problem for me because there are the same rules in my country.
The current fair is very different, with fewer craftspeople around because of the cordon. But we're happy to be here. Something is finally happening. It seems we have to coexist with COVID.
For many traders and customers alike, it comes after a hard year of dealing with a pandemic and uncertainty over what fresh challenges the new year will bring. András Nagy, CGTN, Budapest.
The headlines again. France's president welcomes Germany's new chancellor as the two leaders pledge to keep the Franco-German alliance strong.
Compulsory face coverings in theatres, cinemas and indoor venues as the UK introduces new regulations to stem soaring COVID cases.
And it's London calling. Shell shareholders vote to move the company's headquarters from the Netherlands to the UK.
Well, that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion at cgtn.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.